The sun had barely risen when Dan Whitmore noticed the envelope taped to his front door. It wasn't the usual folded newsletter from the HOA or a community bulletin. This envelope was stark white, sealed tight, with his name typed in bold letters. No greeting. No warmth. Just a simple message printed on the paper inside. You are in violation of Parkland Ridge Code 4.17b unauthorized decorative structure. Fine issued, $1,000. Must be resolved within 10 days. Dan stared at the page, his pulse picking up. Decorative structure. What could that possibly mean? He stepped off his porch, looking left, then right. Lawns were freshly mowed, driveways clean, mailboxes all uniform. Then his eyes settled back on the flower patron, clarid, slightly chipped on the edge, filled with purple sage. It sat by the steps, unmoved since the day he placed it there, nearly 2 years ago. It wasn't just any pot. It had belonged to his wife, Jenna. Dan had kept it outside as a quiet way to remember her. A place she used to rest her coffee cup during the mornings. She'd sit there barefoot, watching the neighborhood wake up. After her passing, Don never had the heart to move it, and now, according to the HOA, it was worth $1,000 punishment. He brought the notice inside and placed it on the kitchen counter. He reread the wording. There was no photo attached, no explanation. Just a line about aesthetic violations and the code number, which led to a long, vague sentence about unauthorized items placed in common view. Don wasn't the type to jump to anger, but the absurdity of it lit a quiet fuse. He walked back outside, took a few photos of the pot, then began scanning the neighborhood. He counted 6 porches with wind chimes, 2 with decorative flags. One had a small water fountain far more extravagant than his humble pot. None of them, as far as he knew, had received a violation. He tried calling the HOA number listed at the bottom of the letter. It rang once. Then a robotic voice answered. The voicemail box you have reached is full. No chance to leave a message. No other contact. Don drove down to the HOA office the next morning. A locked door greeted him with a small sign. HOA office hours, first Tuesday of the month, 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. It was Friday. The next meeting was 10 days away, the same day his fine was due. He returned home and started drafting a letter. He included photos, cited similar decorative items around the neighborhood, and respectfully requested clarification and removal of the fine. He slipped the letter under the HOA office door. He emailed a copy to the listed account. He even printed another and mailed it via certified post, just to be sure. And then he waited. 3 days later, a new letter appeared. No envelope, this time just a folded sheet, tucked crudely into his doorframe. It read, "Violation remains. No further warnings will be issued. Late fees will apply starting the 11th day." No explanation. No response to his letter. Just a cold threat. Don folded the notice slowly and placed it on top of the first one. He looked back at the flower pot on his porch. For the first time since Jenna's passing, it felt like something sacred had been violated. He didn't know what the next step would be, but something deep inside him, something steady and unshakable, began to stir. Not everyone starts a fight, but sometimes, a fight finds you. By the following week, Dan began to notice a change. Not in the HOA's behavior that remained predictably silent and firm, but in his neighbors. The couple across the street, who had once invited him to backyard barbecues, suddenly avoided eye contact. A woman walking her dog paused at the edge of his driveway, looked up at his porch, and quickly turned back the way she came. Dan had lived in Parkland Ridge for over 5 years. It was the kind of place where people prided themselves on civility, where holiday lights blinked in perfect rows and kids waved to mail carriers. But now, it was as if he had become invisible. Or worse, contaminated. At first, he chalked it up to bad timing. Maybe people were just busy. Maybe they hadn't seen the notices on his door. But then, a week after the second violation, Dan received a text from his next-door neighbor, Ron. "Hey Dan, sorry to bother. Just wanted to let you know Marla was at my door this morning. She asked if you'd been acting strangely lately. Thought you should know." Dan stared at the message. He had barely spoken to Marla in over a year. She was the HOA president, known for her perfectly trimmed rose bushes and her habit of walking the neighborhood with a clipboard every Saturday morning. Marla never smiled. She didn't greet, she observed. Later that day, Don stood outside trimming his hedge when he saw her walking slowly along the opposite side of the street. Her eyes didn't meet his, but her pen moved across a small notepad as she passed. He kept trimming. .com. Even, deliberate strokes. But in his chest, something was coiling, tightening. That evening, Don logged into the Parkland Ridge online portal. He searched the community bylaws, hoping to find something more concrete about the violation code. But what he found instead disturbed him. Under HOA code enforcement policy, there was a section labeled Community Complaints. According to the rules, violations could be triggered by anonymous reports from residents. No verification needed, no requirement for evidence. Just a single complaint, and the board could act as judge and executioner. He closed the laptop and looked around his living room. For the first time, his house didn't feel like a home. It felt like a glass box. The next morning, another letter arrived. This time, it was for excessive trash bin visibility, a supposed infraction that occurred when his bin had remained by the curb for 20 minutes past collection. 20 minutes. Don checked his security footage. He had brought the bin in less than half an hour after the truck had passed. Yet the letter stated he'd receive an additional $100 fine if it happened again. That night, unable to sleep, Dan went for a walk. The neighborhood was dark, quiet, sprinklers clicked on, timed like soldiers. He stopped in front of his neighbor's house, one with 2 pots flanking the door. Identical in size to his, one even had decorative lights, no violations, no notes. The pattern was forming, but no one would say it aloud. The following afternoon, as Don checked his mailbox, he caught sight of a paper slipping out of his neighbor's hand. The man froze when their eyes met. Then, awkwardly, he waved and hurried back inside. Don picked up the paper. It was a copy of the community bulletin, but scribbled on the back was a note, hastily written. "You're not the only one, but they watch who speaks." Dan folded it and slipped it into his pocket. His front door felt heavier than usual when he opened it. The pot sat quietly, unchanged, but now, Dan saw it for what it really was, not just a violation, a trigger, and someone had pulled it. It began subtly at first. Don thought he was imagining things, just tricks of the eye, but the pattern repeated. A dark SUV rolled slowly past his house each morning between 6:45 and 7 a.m. It never stopped, never parked, just passed by, paused at the corner, then turned out of sight. He wouldn't have thought much of it. But then one morning, he saw a figure in the passenger seat with a phone held up to the window. A faint flash. Then the car disappeared. That same day, Don found a small orange sticker pressed to the side of his mailbox post. It wasn't obvious hidden from the front, only visible from the yard side. No text, no symbols, just a single, bright dot. He peeled it off and turned it in his fingers. Why mark his mailbox? Was it random? Or a signal? Dan walked the block. Carefully, quietly, he scanned each mailbox. Only one other house had the same sticker, an elderly man named Gus, whose front yard had been cited for non-conforming bird feeders the previous month. Gus, who rarely left the house and whose daughter picked up his groceries. That night, Don checked his security footage. He rewound to the hour the sticker had appeared. At 3:02 a.m., a person in a hoodie approached the mailbox. No vehicle in sight. They moved quickly, pressed the sticker on, and walked off into the dark. The camera angle caught only a partial profile, but the figure carried something familiar. Clipboard. Don froze the frame and stared. The clipboard had a crack along the top corner. He had seen that exact crack before. During last month's HOA meeting, clutched under the arm of Vice President Rick Thompson, the same man who had refused to let Dan speak longer than 2 minutes. Dan took screenshots, saved them, backed them, up on 2 drives. Then he kept watching. At 3:12 a.m., the same figure returned, this time walking across Dan's lawn, stopping at the porch. They leaned in and raised a phone, a flash. Then they were gone. Dan didn't sleep that night. The next morning, a new letter arrived. Violation, porch clutter visible from sidewalk. Attached was a grainy photo cropped closely to his flower pot, now labeled unauthorized personal item. It wasn't just enforcement. It was targeted, tactical, and Dan was being watched. He drove to the town clerk's office. He requested access to the public HOA filings, bylaws, leadership terms, and community board elections. The receptionist, a woman in her late 60s with tired eyes, handed him a thick folder. "You're the third one this year asking for this," she said quietly, her voice just above a whisper. Don raised an eyebrow. "Third," she nodded. "Most don't follow through. They lose interest, or life gets too hard. People don't like conflict." He didn't respond. He took the folder, drove home, and began reading. There it was on page 47. A clause stating that HOA leadership elections must be held annually, with notice posted no less than 45 days in advance. But the last community vote Dan remembered was over 3 years ago, and even then, it hadn't been a vote. Just an announcement that Marla and the board would continue service. There had been no nominations. No ballots. Just a statement by evening. Dan had flagged 14 separate bylaw violations committed by the board itself. Violations that, on paper, made their current positions invalid. He sat back in his chair and stared at the printout. The HOA had marked his mailbox, had trespassed onto his property, had issued arbitrary punishments with no hearing, no evidence, and yet they had no legal foundation. For the first time since this all began, Dan didn't feel powerless. He felt angry, and anger was something he hadn't allowed himself in a very long time. Don spent the next 2 days indoors with the curtains drawn and his phone off. He sat at his dining table, surrounded by documents, notebooks, and printouts. The HOA's own bylaws were scattered across the table, highlighted, underlined, TABBED. That the deeper he read, the clearer the path became. The entire board's authority hinged on one detail: annual elections. According to the original charter signed when Parkland Ridge was founded, failure to hold a public election within each calendar year would render the board's positions vacant. Until a new vote was held, no HOA member could impose fines or make policy decisions on behalf of the community. Don double-checked the HOA meeting notes posted online. The most recent election had been a closed-door vote between existing board members. No public nomination. No ballots, no opportunity for residents to participate. It was invalid with a few more late-night hours of research. Dan drafted a formal challenge. He cited the bylaw clause, listed the past 5 fines he'd received, and attached the security footage still showing the unauthorized porch inspection. He formatted the challenge like a motion: cold, neutral, factual. He printed 12 copies. But he wasn't naive. A letter wouldn't change anything. Not with this board. If he wanted to shift the balance, he needed people. He started with Ron next door. Dan knocked lightly, unsure how much his neighbor knew or how much he wanted to know. But Ron opened the door with a grim look on his face, as if he'd been expecting the knock. "They fined me last year for my daughter's sidewalk chalk," he said before Dan could speak. "Set it defaced community surfaces. I scrubbed it clean myself. Then got hit with a landscaping fine the next month." Don nodded. "It's not just you. I'm collecting everything I can. I'm going to call a public vote. But I can't do it alone." Ron's hesitation lasted only a breath. Then he stepped aside and waved Dan in. By the end of the week, Dan had built a quiet coalition. It started with 3 families, then 6. By the 10th day, he had spoken to over 24 residents, each with their own story. A woman who was fined for a welcome mat with a printed phrase. A single father whose mailbox was deemed too rustic. An elderly couple who received a threatening letter after placing a bench under their tree. No one had ever pushed back. Most had paid and kept quiet. But now, Don gave them something they hadn't had before: proof, and a plan. Using the clause in the HOA charter, Dan called for a special election vote. It was his right if 1/3 of homeowners supported the motion. The bylaws required a public ballot. He gathered 46 signatures, 10 more than necessary. He submitted the petition by certified mail and taped a copy to the HOA office door, this time with a signature list attached. Then he posted the notice to the community's online forum. The next morning, every post on the forum was gone. Deleted. The message board was locked. Later that afternoon, someone tore down the copy of the petition from the HOA office door, but Dan was ready. He walked back and replaced it with 5 more tapped to the windows, the mailbox, and the sidewalk board. This time, he wrote only one sentence at the bottom: "We're not asking for change, we're voting for it." He returned home and waited. Not for a response, but for the reaction. Because after everything, every sticker, every photo, every silent neighborden had finally done something that couldn't be ignored. He'd spoken out loud. And now, the quiet war had become something else entirely. The retaliation didn't come immediately. It came quietly, like fog rolling in just after sunset, slow, creeping, hard to pinpoint until it was all around. 3 days after Dan posted the election petition, he found one of his tires slashed. The next day, someone dumped a small bag of garbage across his front steps. No one saw who did it. No camera caught the act. But Don knew it wasn't random. Not anymore. He pressed forward anyway. The community was talking, whispering on driveways, murmuring during morning walks. His phone buzzed with private messages from homeowners who had seen the petition. Most were cautious, wary, asking if it was safe to speak openly. A few wanted to remain anonymous but offered support. But just as quickly as momentum built, the board struck back. That weekend, dozens of homes received flyers in their mailboxes, unmarked, unstamped, printed on the same white paper used for violation letters. The message was short and sharp. Certain residents are spreading misinformation and inciting hostility. Anyone encouraging disruption will be reported and fined accordingly. Dawn wasn't named, but no one had to guess who it was about. 2 days later, an anonymous email blast was sent to the community email list, warning that individuals with unstable histories are attempting to undermine the HOA structure. Attached was a blurred photo of Dawn taken months ago, standing in front of his car, looking disheveled and tired after a long workday. He read the message twice. The photo had been taken without his knowledge. From across the street, someone had been watching him far longer than he thought. That same afternoon, he received another violation: improper storage of tools. It referenced a rake leaning against the side of his garage, something he had used earlier that morning. Then came the visit. Rick Thompson, the HOA vice president, stood at Dan's door with his usual clipboard, flanked by 2 other board members. They didn't ask to come in. They didn't make small talk. Rick held up a letter, folded neatly in his hand. "We've had several complaints, Dan," he said, eyes scanning the porch. "People are concerned. The neighborhood doesn't like tension." Dan didn't flinch. "The neighborhood's tired of being quiet." Rick gave a thin smile. "Some of your accusations could be seen as defamatory. Do you have proof of these so-called violations?" Dan didn't answer. He simply turned, walked into his living room, and returned with a USB drive. He handed it over without a word. "I've backed it all up. 3 copies. Distributed already." For the first time, Rick's expression changed. His grip on the clipboard tightened. "Will, take this." Under advisement, he muttered, retreating down the steps. Dan watched them leave. The air felt heavier, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. That night, he got a message from a woman named Leo, someone he barely knew. She lived 3 blocks over. "They tried to fine me last month for leaving my porch light on overnight. I paid. I was scared, but I saw what you posted. I'm in." 2 more followed. Then 6. By morning, Dawn had over 30 residents confirmed to attend the upcoming vote. The smear campaign had failed to silence him. In fact, it had done the opposite. It had proven his point. Dan walked out onto his porch just before sunrise and looked at the flower pot, the one that had started it all. Still intact, still peaceful, but no longer just a memorial now. It was a marker, a boundary line, a symbol. Whatever came next, Don knew he had crossed a line he could never uncross. And so had they. Election day arrived with a strange stillness. The sun hung low behind a wall of gray clouds, and the air in Parkland Ridge carried a thick, watchful tension. The community center, a squat brick building that usually hosted yoga classes and birthday parties, was now the center of something entirely different. Don arrived 10 minutes early. A leather binder tucked under his arm and copies of the HOA bylaws printed and highlighted inside. He was surprised to see a small line already forming outside the double doors. Some neighbors gave him nods. Others avoided his gaze. But none turned away. Inside, the board had already claimed their seats. Marla Jennings, the president, sat rigid in the center, flanked by Rick and 2 other long-serving members. Her expression was unreadable. Don recognized the look. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. The room filled slowly. By the top of the hour, over 70 residents had crowded into the folding chairs, some standing in the back. It was the largest turnout for an HOA meeting in the community's history. Marla opened the meeting with a brisk tone. "This session is to address a baseless petition filed by a homeowner lacking experience and knowledge of board procedures." A few murmurs scattered across the room. Don raised his hand. Marla hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. He stood and cleared his throat. Voice calm but firm. "This isn't about me," Don said, scanning the faces. "It's about the fact that this board hasn't held a proper election in 3 years. That's not opinion. It's printed in the bylaws. Section 6C. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to make sure the people who live here have a voice." He reached into his binder and pulled out a stack of papers, 46 signatures, all verified homeowners. That's more than the 1/3 required to trigger a public vote. Marla narrowed her eyes. Even if that were true, it is true, Dan interrupted. And if you disagree, then say so under oath. Because this meeting is being recorded. Not by me. By 3 different residents. That footage will be submitted if needed. Gasps and shifting chairs followed. Marla looked over at Rick. He said nothing. The silence dragged. Then, slowly, one of the board members, Elaine, who rarely spoke at meetings, set her pen down and stood. I reviewed the bylaws myself, she said. Everything he's said checks out. We haven't followed procedure. Marla's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Elaine turned to the room. I motioned for an emergency vote. All in favor. Hands began to rise. Slowly at first, then all at once, more than half the room. Rick tried to protest, citing procedural confusion, but his voice was drowned out by a quiet, building rhythm, the shuffle of ballots being passed, the scratch of pens, the quiet exchange of paper. It took 15 minutes. That's all. When the count was finished, Dan was announced as the new HOA president with a 78% vote in his favor. Rick's name was on the ballot. He didn't break 10%. Marla didn't stay to hear the final count. She stood, collected her clipboard, and walked out without a word. The room erupted into murmurs, some applause, some stunned silence. Don didn't celebrate. He didn't raise his hands or give a speech. He simply sat back down and looked at the binder in front of him. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. It was just the moment the game changed. And for the first time in Parkland Ridge, the rules had finally started working for the people who lived there, not just those who enforced them. Dan didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table long after midnight. The new binder open in front of him, no longer filled with notes and complaints, but with responsibilities. He was the president now. Not in title alone, but in obligation. The votes had been counted, the bylaws upheld, and the former board had walked away without even pretending to hand anything over. There was no transition, no guidance, just silence and an unlocked filing cabinet at the HOA office with half the paperwork missing. The next morning, Dan sent out a message to every resident on the community email list. It was short, direct, and handwritten. This isn't about revenge. It's about resetting what this neighborhood was supposed to be. The fines are suspended. The violation system is frozen pending review. I invite all residents to the community lawn this Saturday. No rules, no forms, just people. He expected 20 to show up. Maybe 30. Nearly 100 came. Some brought lawn chairs, others brought kids and casseroles. For the first time in years, the center of Parkland Ridge buzzed not with tension, but conversation. Don didn't give a speech. He set up a folding table with coffee, blank suggestion cards, and a simple sign that read, "Let's fix this together." One by one, neighbors approached him. Some offered support. Others shared stories. Most simply said, "Thank you." But it wasn't all relief. As the crowd thinned and the evening cooled, an elderly man approached with slow steps. His name was Gerald, a former civil engineer who had lived in the neighborhood since the first homes were built. "They made it this way on purpose," Gerald said softly, tapping the table with one finger. Marla and her friends. They knew people wouldn't read the bylaws. They kept the meetings vague. No minutes posted. No transparency. It wasn't carelessness, it was design. Don nodded. "I believe it." Gerald leaned in slightly. "You're in now, be careful. The people who want control don't always give up quietly. Sometimes they just change tactics." Don didn't forget those words. The following week, he began his review of the HOA's financial records. What he found wasn't illegal. But it wasn't right either. Thousands of dollars in administrative expenses paid out to companies owned by relatives of board members. Landscaping contracts with inflated charges. Violations issued that led directly to fines, which were funneled into discretionary funds with no oversight. He compiled a full report and released it to the neighborhood without commentary, just facts, numbers, and documents. The reaction was swift. Some residents were furious. Others embarrassed they hadn't spoken sooner. One woman, who had paid over $2,500 in accumulated fines for excessive garden decor, cried as she read the breakdown. Don met with a local attorney, and with his help, drafted refund letters for every improperly issued violation going back 3 years. He didn't have the authority to punish, but he could correct. Word spread beyond Parkland Ridge. A local journalist reached out. A segment aired on the weekend news. Not naming names, but spotlighting the community's rare shift in governance. That same weekend, the for sale sign appeared in Marla Jennings' front yard. The shutters were already closed. Her rose bushes were gone. Dan didn't feel satisfaction. Just completion. He ended the week the way he began, with quiet work, reviewing community concerns submitted through suggestion cards. Many were small things: lighting for walking paths, more inclusive holiday decor, a return of the community BB, but one stood out. Scrawled in crooked handwriting, it simply said, "Thank you for reminding us, this is our home too." Dawn folded the note, placed it in the binder, and marked the date. A shift had occurred. Not loud, not violent, but lasting. The clay pot still sat by the porch. It hadn't moved an inch since the first letter was taped to Dan's door. The chipped rim, the faded color, the lavender now dried but not forgotten. It was never about the pot. That was just the opening. Shot in a battle that revealed the quiet rot beneath the surface of a well-manicured neighborhood. But now, beside it, there was another. Identical in shape and size. But this one was painted gold, not shiny, not garish. Just enough to catch the light when the sun passed overhead. And inside it, wildflowers. Untrimmed, untamed, blooming freely. No sign marked them. No plaque explained their meaning. But every person who passed his walkway paused, if only for a moment. Some of them knew the story. Some had only heard whispers. But even those who knew nothing could sense that something had changed, like the air had cleared. That weekend, Dan hosted the first official HOA meeting under the new structure. No one sat at a raised table. No one held clipboards. Instead, folding chairs were placed in a circle on the community lawn. Children played nearby. A barbecue smoked in the distance. There were no speeches, just neighbors talking, listening, unguarded. Don didn't say much during the meeting. He listened. That was enough. Afterward, as he packed away the folding chairs, a man in a clean gray suit approached him. He didn't introduce himself, just handed Dan a plain white envelope. "I live 2 neighborhoods over," he said. "We've got the same issues. Worse, probably. No one speaks up. I heard what you did." Dan hesitated, then took the envelope. Inside was a single sentence. "How did you do it?" Don folded it, placed it in his back pocket, and answered without turning around. "One rule at a time. And I never stopped documenting." The man gave a small nod and walked away. Later that night, Dan stood on his porch, watching the sky turn amber behind the houses. The community felt different now. Not louder or more active, but alive. People walked slower, smiled more. Kids drew chalk art on sidewalks without fear of citations. He reached down and brushed his fingers across the rim of the original flower pot. The clay was cool to the touch, quiet, steady. There was no trophy for what he had done. No headlines, no fanfare. Just a neighborhood returned to the people who actually lived in it. He thought about Marla, and how quickly she had disappeared. No confrontation. No apology, just silence. That, in the end, had been the most telling part of all. But Dan wasn't waiting for closure. He had something better, continuity, and he knew others would come. Other communities. Other people facing quiet oppression behind smiling gates and monthly newsletters. Not everyone would fight, but maybe those who watched this unfold would feel the pull to speak up, even if just once.